Good afternoon to each and everyone present here. Happy Air Force Day. It's a great privilege to see each one of you here, and more so with the collaboration of Manipal Institute of Communications and Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. We thought we should celebrate this day as an honor to all our veterans, all our people, dedicated people in the forces. Though it's an Air Force Day, I'm sure it's all collaborative work of all of them joining together in the forces, and the national morale is always boosted by the forces. That's how we live, and we live peacefully because they are fighting for us. They are there for us. As a remembrance, as a celebration today, we wanted to have this one, and no better person than Air Marshal Matheswaran. Air Marshal Matheswaran is also an adjunct faculty of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. It's an honor to have you here, sir. Our Vice Chancellor has also consented, though his day has been extremely packed. It was only available for us for a very short time, yet he was able to make it. This is a collaborative work, as I said, between us and the Manipal Institute of Communications. It's also a very big institutions within the family of Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Without wasting much time, I would request my colleague, Dr. Padmarani, to give welcome remarks.
Yeah, good afternoon. My warm greetings on the 89th Indian Air Force Day. Air Force is the youngest of the armed forces in India and the fourth largest in the world. Today, on 8th October, marks the Indian Air Force Day, and this is celebrated to honor the Air Force activities that was carried out during the 1971 Indo-Pak War. Air Force, like today, our Prime Minister remarked in his note for the Indian Air Force Day, is a mark of courage, diligence and professionalism, which is also characteristics of all the armed forces in India. It's my privilege to welcome you all to the distinguished lecture by Air Marshal Dr. M. Matheswaran, AVSM, VM, on the occasion of the Indian Air Force Day, jointly organized by Manipal Institute of Communication and Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. Manipal Institute of Communication is a constituent unit of Manipal Academy of Higher Education. It's a premier media and communication institution in the country, offering a range of undergraduate, postgraduate and doctoral programs. The Department of Geopolitics and International Relations offers postgraduate and doctoral programs and has a lot of collaborations with people, organizations working in the area of international relations and national security. Our distinguished lecture is going to be delivered by Air Marshal Dr. M. Matheswaran, AVSM, BM, an Air Force veteran. He is the former Deputy Chief of the Integrated Defense Staff. He was responsible for policy, plans and force structure, development of the three services, including budget analysis, acquisition, procurement and technology management. He was responsible for formulating the long-term and short-term integrated defense plans. He was the Senior Air Staff Officer of the Eastern Command earlier to that. The Air Marshal has had an active service of 39 years in the Indian Air Force. He did his schooling at Sainik School, Amravati Nagar, which I found out from a tweet this morning from one of his schoolmates, and went on to graduate from the National Defense Academy, Khadagwasla. His academic achievements include Masters, MPhil and PhD in Defense and Strategic Studies, and a postgraduate diploma in Financial Management. He is a senior fellow of Executive Education Program on National and International Security, Harvard University, John F. Kennedy School of Governance. He is an alumni of the Defense Staff College and National Defense College. He began his military career as a fighter pilot and commanded a Jaguar Strike Squadron. He is also a fighter combat leader from the IF's Top Gun School called TACDE, where he later served as the directing staff and deputy commandant. He is an experimental test pilot and has flown over 3,200 hours in 40 types of aircrafts, including transport aircrafts and helicopters. He went on to command the prestigious Flight Test Center. ASTE. He is a graduate of the IF's elite fighter weapons establishment, also an experimental test pilot, and has held a number of command and staff appointments such as involving space, EW and information warfare, maritime operations, air staff inspection, air staff requirement concepts, and doctrines for air war strategy. He is also the Air Officer Commanding of the Headquarter Maritime Operations during 2008-2009 and handled the air support activities for tackling the Bombay terrorist attack of 26/11. He is the Assistant Chief of Air Staff for Operations. He was the Senior Staff Officer in charge of operation in the Eastern Air Command before his last appointment. His study reports on LCA and the Kaveri engine program have resulted in the government taking important decisions on these projects. He has submitted a major study on the Indian aeronautical sector in March 2014. Post-retirement, he's taken up the post of advisor strategy to the chairman, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. He is also an advisor to FICCI on airspace and defense industry task force. He is a member of the Executive Council of the IDSA. He's also the visiting faculty for a number of institutions. We are privileged to have you here, sir, with us on this occasion for delivering the lecture on the role of IAF in the national security. We have another distinguished armed force personnel with us today. It's none other than our own Vice Chancellor, Lieutenant General MD Venkatesh. Sir is the 7th Vice Chancellor of Manipal Academy of Higher Education. He took over as Vice Chancellor on July 1st, 2020. He's graduated from Mysore Medical College in 1976 with an exceptional academic record and was commissioned into the Armed Medical Corps in 1979. He acquired his MSc in MS in ENT from Mumbai University in 1986 and is an outstanding ENT surgeon. He has contributed significantly in the field of medical education, having trained generations of undergraduate, postgraduate students in the Armed Forces Medical College, Pune. He also had the unique distinction of holding over the years all academic position of AMC Pune from reader to the dean. He was also the founder faculty of the Department of Medical Education Technology in AFMC. Sir has over 36 years of experience in the armed forces, which besides academics, he has also held numerous administrative positions. And before joining MAHE, he was also the Vice Chancellor of Sikkim Manipal University. We welcome you, sir. I welcome all the faculty, distinguished guests and students who are present virtually. Hope all of you have an enriching experience this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Padma. That was an excellent introduction to both the distinguished people here on the panel. Now I would request our Vice Chancellor, Lieutenant General MD Venkatesh, to deliver the presidential address.
Thank you very much, Professor Nandakishore and Dr. Padma Rani. And I extend a very, very warm greetings to each one of you present here today. And a very special greeting to Air Marshal Matheswaran, from one veteran to another. Very, very happy Air Force Day, sir.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
It's a matter of great pride for MAHE that the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and Manipal Institute of Communications have joined hands together today to commemorate and celebrate the Air Force Day. Today, that is the 8th of October 2021. Extremely commendable, and even more commendable is identifying a distinguished speaker to deliver a very important topic, the role of Air Force in nation building and India's national security. There couldn't have been a better person than Air Marshal Matheswaran. After having heard his CV from Dr. Padma Rani, I'm totally convinced that his exceptional frontline activities as a fighter pilot and his extraordinary administrative demonstration during his various staff and command appointments, and also his role in the development of LCA and Kaveri engine and in the doctrines or nuclear doctrines of the country are really totally highly commendable, and I'm sure he deserves a huge round of applause and our thanks and gratitude for the role that he has played in the security of the country as being part of this wonderful force, the Indian Air Force. The Indian Air Force, the Indian Army, and the Indian Navy are perhaps three of the greatest institutions that the country has. And over the years, repeatedly, the three forces have stood together, put their hands together, stood up for the nation in the external aggression, in the internal security, and also in terms of, humanitarian aid missions, not only within the country, outside of the country. In fact, the entire world remembers the role played by Indian Air Force, Indian Army, and the Indian Navy, and also as part of the Indian peacekeeping force in the UN. The commendable role played by the services is worthy of high commendation. Notwithstanding, even today, the three services are really true role models of how the institutions in the country should, join hands together, should put, to put their might together to work as a team. Because I firmly believe that the acronym of team, that TEAM, is together each one achieves more. And this has been demonstrated many times over by the three forces. And this is one of the things that distinguishes every member of the armed forces from the others, that each one believes that he is an important member of the team and also shows the leadership skills and the capabilities of forge a good team towards achieving the end objective, which has always been victory for the service, victory for the nation, and victory for the mankind. Without doubt, there is we are very convinced that the Indian Air Force has played a great role in nation building and in maintenance of national security. And to hear this in a more detailed manner, I think we are awaiting the delivery of this lecture by very distinguished lecture by Marshal Matheswaran. And as far as MAHE is concerned, we have great respect for our services. We always remember them, and it is more demonstrated by the fact that the university is headed by a veteran from the services. I think this is something which makes us all feel proud of, and to have amongst us one of the most distinguished veterans from the Air Force, it's a matter of great pride for all of us today, sir. And all the people who are awaiting, especially the people who are in the field of geopolitics, international relations, and communication, and many others who are part of this forum today, are very eager to listen to you, sir. And without much ado, once again, let me thank you for accepting this invitation from the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and Manipal Institute of Communication and MAHE to be part of our celebration of Indian Air Force Day, and for you to accepting to deliver your keynote address on role of Air Force in nation building and India's national security. Thank you once again. I wish this program all the success, and I'm sure Sir's lecture will be an eye-opener for us, and it will also be a thought-provoking lecture for all those youngsters who are listening to him today. Thank you very much, and Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that excellent proposition and setting the tone for the lecture itself. As we celebrate the Air Force Day, as it is said, because the motto itself was drawn from the Gita. This was cleared when it was proposed. It was cleared by none other than the Supreme Commander of the forces then, Babu Rajendra Prasad, which said that Nabhas Prisham Deepta Maneka Varnam Vyattananam Deepta Vishala Netram Drishtahitvam Pravyatitataratma Dhritiman Vindami Shamancha Vishnu. This is precisely from this particular verse when Arjuna was confused. It was by looking at the way Krishna was seen and the way the lights were there, were touching the sky with glory. His glory was so much that he looked at and that's the same spirit that was drawn by the forces. And today we have a person whose glory is none the less of any other individuals that we have seen, perhaps the one who has served the country with so much of pride. Now over to you, sir, Air Marshal Matheswaran.
Thank you, Dr. Nandkishore. Let me, at the outset, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank everybody, but particularly the Vice Chancellor, General Dr. Venkatesh. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk on the Air Force Day to everybody here. So thank you, Dr. Padmarani, for this, very long introduction of mine. Much of those positions I've finished, and I'm now primarily involved with the Peninsula Foundation, which is a think tank, and of course I continue to consult and advise on defense and aerospace strategies as well. Thank you, Dr. Kishore, for organizing this. But I must also, the outset, there's a double, happiness for me here to address the Manipal University and the faculty and the students. My son graduated from the Manipal Institute of Technology in aerospace engineering, and we are very happy that he went through this institution, a great institution. And right now he's about to complete his PhD in aerospace engineering in the US. So that gives me immense pleasure as well to address you all. Let me come to the topic of the day, and the Indian Air Force completes 89 years today. It is entering into the decade towards the centenary year we are looking forward to in 2032. It is one of the oldest air forces in the world as well, and it is one of the most powerful air forces. It's the fourth largest air force, and it is the history, the traditions, and the culture are for anyone who served in the Air Force was complete integrated with us in our life and part and parcel of our life forever. When you look at nation building, the process of Indian Air Force role in nation building is well established from the time of India's independence. But before that, let me give a little bit of history earlier. The Indian Air Force came into existence in 1932, and in the process of the first 2 decades, it grew from a few flights with Hawaii Supplies into a formidable force. It played a major role in defending India in the Burma campaign against the Japanese invasion as part of the Royal Indian Air Force. And some of our stalwarts, particularly the Marshal of the Indian Air Force, Arjun Singh, played a stellar role in the campaign against the Japanese in the Burma theater. Today, the British historians and the British researchers have gone on record to say the Burma campaign, the Burma theater war, is probably the toughest wars that have actually happened in the entire Second World War. And those of you who've had the chance to visit, Kohima and Imphal and those cemeteries, you will understand the history and the toughness of the battle that the Japanese gave, to the Allied forces, and the role of, air power in this entire process will become clear. So Indian Air Force, I would say, matured in the Second World War through the Burma campaign particularly. So after independence, when we came in, the partition was a huge, a disaster that actually, a humanitarian disaster, I would say. And that, along with the invasion by the Pakistani forces into J&K, created a major emergency for the national leadership. And this is where the Indian Air Force played a stellar role. One is to address the humanitarian crisis as part of the partition issue. So as I said, 47-48 is an important milestone. And I will explain that a little later in terms of nation building. But at the same time, as India got its independence in 47-48, there were more challenges to integrate, rest of the regions of the country. And this is where, again, the Air Force's role, along with the other elements of the military, Army and the Navy, comes into play. So 1961 was the liberation of Goa from the Portuguese. We had the war with China in 1962. Unfortunately, the Indian Air Force was not used in the offensive role, in the active operational role, other than providing, support logistical role and air communication role. This was a major blunder in terms of national decision making. We could discuss that as we come into the Q&A session. Thereafter, of course, we had the war in 65. We had the war in 71. And today, I mean, this year is the 50th anniversary of the 1971 Bangladesh War. And the role of Indian Air Force is extremely well known. And in fact, the surrender process began with the final attack on the governor's house in December 15th in Bangladesh, which precipitated the surrender process completely. And the rest of it is, the history is well known. The Air Force has always been seen as, a very important instrument that cannot be used lightly in any conflict situations. And therefore, generally after 71, there's been a reluctance to use air power, assuming that it is escalatory. We crossed that barrier in 1999 in the Kargil War, when Prime Minister Vajpayee finally took the decision to employ air power, and that is again a watershed moment in Indian Air Force's history. The Kargil War and the results of it is well known as well. We mobilized in 2001 after the Parliament attack, and of course the continuous processes of conflict situations, by the needling of the Chinese in Ladakh and of course Pakistani cross-border terrorism, etc., have been an ongoing challenges that we continue to meet. But I think the Balakot strike is again another watershed moment where after 71, India demonstrates use of air power to cross the international border and send out a clear message to the adversary. So these are important, elements in the history as we celebrate the 89th, raising day of the Indian Air Force today. Can you move on to the next slide, please? So in terms of nation building, as I said, 47-48, this is, the historic pictures there with Nehru and of course the crisis situations in Ladakh airlift. The air maintenance proved an extremely important, air support proved an extremely important factor in recovering or in defending Kashmir, moving the ground forces to the scenes of battle and scenes of force application to stop the invasion and push them back. And of course, the Dakotas were used by Air Commodore Meher Baba at that point of time to land at an altitude of nearly 11,000 feet. It had not been done anywhere else in the world, to airlift people, move tanks, and then shift forces into the Kashmir Srinagar Valley as well. So this is one of the most important challenges immediately after independence, that India as a nation that is just trying to integrate various parts of the country, and this is where the military comes into play, and the air power and Indian Air Force played a stellar role in the entire process. Air maintenance is an activity that's going on even today in much of the border regions, in the high altitude regions, in Himalayas, in the northeast, in the corners of Arunachal Pradesh, and further down into borders with Burma, Myanmar, and even in borders with Bangladesh. Air maintenance is a continuous activity because the terrain is treacherous. The road communications are a big challenge. And as a SASO in Eastern Air Command in Shillong, this is one of the most important tasks that we have to do year on, continuously. And this is something we've continued to do. Because in times of monsoons, the regions get flooded and large portions get cut off as well. So the air maintenance activity where supplies are airdropped to, I'm not talking about military maintenance, I'm talking about people's villages that still do not have adequate communication, cut off by physical geographical features and snowbound regions, etc. They are being continuously maintained by the Air Force, and therefore the linkage between, there's an emotional linkage between people of those regions and the Indian Air Force, over the last 70 years. Apart from that, the HADR, Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief process, again, I'm talking about within the country. in these northeastern regions and up into the Himalayas, and you would have heard about continuous, incidents in Himachal Pradesh of, avalanches and flooding, etc. The Air Force, and of course, along with the Army, plays a stellar role in addressing these disaster situations. And I brought out into the year around 2011, we made a complete study of the history of Indian Air Force's role in air maintenance and disaster relief as part of the process towards nation building. And that book is available. I'm sure a copy would be made available to Manipal University. It's an excellent history in nation building that needs to be studied as well. Assistance to civil authorities is again a part of the nation building process. And India, in the initial years, we've now over 70 years, we've stabilized in most areas, but in much of the regions in the northeast, as well as in J&K and Ladakh area, the ongoing insurgencies, etc., have been a challenge, and therefore, these could manifest itself into many disturbances, which needs continuous assistance. The police and the civil authorities may not be able to control. Sometimes, many at times, it goes out of their, goes beyond their limitations, and therefore the military is called in. The air power is again, and the Air Force's assistance is significantly important here. The most important characteristic of the air power or Indian Air Force is to be able to respond rapidly to a crisis situation. If you look at tsunami that happened in 2004, within 6 hours, the AN-32 was landing in an airfield, Karnik, in the southern part of Nicobar, with airfield already 1/3 of the airfield submerged in the sea waters. Nevertheless, the aircraft landed there to evacuate people. The whole airbase there was completely demolished, but you had to rescue people and then provide assistance to those who were living in nearby regions as well. So the ability of Air Force to respond immediately to a crisis situation is extremely important. And that you would have seen in the way we, as India responded to the earthquake, massive earthquake in 2015 in Nepal, or for that matter in, disaster situations in Himachal Pradesh that happened in 2013, and again a few years earlier in the last 2-3 years as well. So this is, all this actually contributes to understanding the importance that the military and the Air Force in particular, plays towards strengthening the nation and to the process of nation building. Can we move on to the next slide, please? This is the study, it's titled as So That Others May Live. It's a fine book with excellent photographs and a history very nicely recounted, and focused entirely on the process of how the transport fleet, the helicopter fleets, and of course the constant engagement with air maintenance to far-off regions, etc., are very well documented and extremely well covered in this process. So nation building process is a continuous process, and this is something the military is it's second nature to them to assist the government and the civil authorities in this process. Yeah, next one. India is a fabulous, country because you have the highest mountains in the world, you have the deserts, you have tropical forests, you have monsoons that are, bring copious rains and sometimes are, unpredictably severe, with the recent patterns indicating the impact of climate, change. But at the same time, we also have, we are prone to, in the Bay of Bengal, particularly to frequent cyclones and tropical cyclones that create tremendous challenges to the civil administration in terms of handling various issues. Notwithstanding all that, much of our border regions, we have a continuous dispute with the Chinese, we have a territorial dispute with Pakistanis, and therefore the army and the paramilitary forces are deployed in the border regions, and many of those regions have to be supported by air maintenance. For example, one of the important regions is a place called Dras near Kargil, where you need to stock up for 6 months. This is October. They would have already stocked up because the posts in that region get snow locked for the next 6 months. And therefore you need to stock it up. And therefore the maintenance subsequently is only through air. Siachen, we established our posts in 1984. There are more people who are affected by weather and who are casualties. But nevertheless, because of geopolitical reasons, we continue to maintain our posts and successfully in Siachen area. And without air support, without air maintenance, it's almost impossible to hold those positions. And therefore, supporting the army and the paramilitary in border maintenance is a combination of not only holding the nation together, but it's in the context of national security, it's a vital element of Indian Air Force's role. Integrating remote corners through logistics and humanitarian support, which is what I explained with respect to civil regions that are not well connected, is a continuous process and a vital element which is not very well known to many people, and therefore this is something needs to be appreciated. Supporting the administration in governance is a continuous process, whether it's for law and order or whether it's for disaster relief. This is something an extremely important role for the military, and the Air Force, with its ability to actually respond quickly, becomes a vital instrument in the hands of the government. Next slide. Okay, so let's come to the national security part. The way wars have evolved since Second World War, the role of air power in modern wars has become critical. Today, no nation can win a war without a strong, air force and an air power capability. And war patterns have changed. We will discuss that subsequently. But the way technology has evolved, the way effectiveness has come through application of air power, it is, its ability to actually influence national security policies and doctrines and strategies has become extremely important. So the IAF's role as per the Union War Book is defending the skies of the country, and therefore air defense is a primary role for the Indian Air Force and an extremely important role. But from that flows many other, abilities that should be harnessed, which becomes unique to the Indian Air Force, and that needs to be harnessed in the context of developing its force structure as well as employing the Indian Air Force in the right fashion. And what are those capabilities that the Indian Air Force brings in, or any Air Force in any country would be able to bring it in if it is structured correctly? One is the deterrence capability. We all generally tend to look at deterrence only from a nuclear deterrence perspective. But conventional deterrence today, to be able to actually send out a message through right application of air power, deters the adversary far more effectively than to be able to amass huge numbers of troops on the ground. And Balakot is an example that actually, if you've sent a message, that needs to be followed up consistently for any future events with much stronger response. And therefore, the ability to deter adversary through application of air power is an important element in developing national security strategies. What are the factors that contribute to it? One, technology has contributed immensely today, and the most important element is, unlike in earlier times where you're looking at more and more explosive power to destroy the maximum possible destruction that you want to create in a target area, today you have the ability to destroy or neutralize precisely the target that you seek to neutralize. And therefore, precision becomes the most important capability that air power brings into it. Second is power projection. Any country that aspires to be a great power, it needs to project its power. And the ability to project power is easily possible through the application of air power. And that brings in the elements of coercion and compellence. It's not easy to go into a conventional war, unlike the times before Second World War. It is far more expensive. Economies take a beating. People suffer. There's a lot more destruction that takes place, and therefore war is the last choice for any governments. But again, in a situation where you need to get the adversary to, bend to your dictates or bend to your, requirements, there are multiple instruments that a nation, uses, from political to economic to very international coordination for application of multilateral pressures. But more importantly, at the back of all that is the military power, and air power is the most important one, which can coerce an adversary or a party that is crossing the red lines into behaving correctly. So it is controlling behavior through coercive, application of air power. And compellence, more or less, is a corollary to the coercive process. Coercion creates fear so that you're able to coerce the adversary to behave the way you want. Compellence is a sort of making the adversary understand the logic and the reality of the situation, and therefore there is a better understanding and better appreciation in which the person is, or the adversarial side, conforms to the requirements that we put across. Dissuasion and persuasion is a continuous process. Again, depending upon, the adversarial situation, you project your power in a way where it creates adequate dissuasive ability to, prevent an emerging conflict or prevent any misadventures from the other side. General Sundarji believed in dissuasive strategies in a big way. And dissuasion invariably is linked to the nuclear capabilities and, of course, the other military capabilities. But the air power leads in this entire process unless you actually have a very significant capability in the in your ability to apply air power as quickly as possible. The dissuasive strategy will tend to be weak, and dissuasive strategy is an important element. Persuasion is, of course, it's a multifaceted one. It includes, dealing with rest of the friendly countries as well, but military power is at the back of it. And therefore, this is an important, element that comes into national security strategy as well. Military diplomacy is, again, is a softer side of, using military capabilities, is to, coordinate with the external affairs, coordinate with the diplomats, to be able to actually build partnerships and collaborations with friendly countries, to be able to see our point of view. So if we have a border dispute and we have a cross-border terrorist problem, we need to actually use military diplomacy as well to say what would happen if somebody crosses the red line, and then there is a red line that we clearly define, and we need to make our friends to understand that, and therefore they bring in the pressure on the other side to make them understand and behave in an appropriate manner. So military diplomacy is a continuous process, and all capabilities of whether it's Air Force, military, Army, or the Navy, all come into play. But once again, military diplomacy becomes very successful when you actually demonstrate various strengths. It's not only about creating the understanding of force capability that India has, but also in terms of benign capability that India can actually bring to help friendly countries and the region as a whole. And this is where the expeditionary capability comes into play for HADR missions. So when we responded as quickly as possible, we were the first responders actually for the Nepal earthquake. You're actually sending a message to the rest of the world that India has an expeditionary capability which can actually be beneficial to friendly countries. And that expeditionary capability is fundamentally rooted in the Indian Air Force's capability. So with C-17s, C-130s, with new aircraft that we probably would give in with C-295, which is just recently be cleared. When you actually expand your transport and helicopter capabilities in a big way, then the entire South Asian region, all these countries should get the confidence that in a situation, in a crisis situation that involves, natural disasters or any other, crisis, we can look up to India to be able to respond as quickly as possible. So in 1989, when Maldives actually, some of the rogue elements went and, put the president under house arrest and took control of the island, India responded immediately. India responded with with airlifting its paratroopers and recovered within 48 hours. We actually were able to actually get the control back to the correct authorities in Maldives, and that again sends a very strong message, and all that the air power ability is extremely important. The last part that plays, which many people miss out generally, because we look at the defense economy, we completely divorce it from its linkage to the military, is a big mistake that generally is made. And why do I say that? Because if a national security process is strongly linked to economy and industry as well. And therefore, if the Indian Air Force's much of its military capability, if it doesn't come from within the industrial capability, within the industrial research that we do within this country, and if it doesn't actually contribute to generating jobs and generating education and generating people like you all understand and become experts and come into the industrial process, then the economy actually suffers. And this is something that must be well understood by the civilian, the people like you all and the others in the civil street, that arming the Indian military is extremely important through an indigenous industrial process and indigenous research. And that contributes to the economy as a whole. And therefore, defense economy becomes an extremely strong and critical part of the national economy. Those of you who want to understand this better, you must study the strategic directions that General Charles de Gaulle gave for the French Fourth Republic when they took power after the Second World War. And the most important direction that was given was to concentrate on the arms industry and arms exports, because that not only firstly arms and creates the strength for French defense industry, but more importantly, it will create and it will strengthen the economy because the arms exports becomes a significant part. But beyond that, it actually strengthens education, it strengthens research and development, brings about technology control, critical technology come within the country's control. So today, because of that kind of a strategic process, the French defense industry pretty much makes every critical technologies within their control. They don't depend on the Americans or they don't depend on anybody else. So this is a strategic process where I think needs to be understood extremely well. And the leading technologies are invariably in the Air Force domain. And therefore, it's extremely important to link, the defense economy to national security strategy as a very, very important element. And this is something that I've been talking about in many areas as well. Can I move on to the next slide? Sure, can you shift to the next slide, please? Yeah, okay. So coming to the Air Force itself, so all of you must be aware that, the Indian Air Force in terms of force strength has been in a bit of a decline. Our fighter force strength as of today is 30 squadrons. The authorized strength is 42 squadrons. And given the economic growth that we have, given the aspirations to be a great power in the international order and become one of the poles of the 21st century's international governance, you need a strong military. And that is a worry. And therefore, why have we come down to this 30 squadron? Because in the next 10 years, there will be more older aircraft that will be phased out, and you will still come down from 30 probably to 25. While the Tejas, which is an indigenous success story, but it's taken some time, while the production of Tejas starts coming in, it will still take some time before you actually, start going up the curve. And, Tejas is the first cut of the indigenous fighter aircraft after a break that we've had from HF-24. What India needs is the Tejas Mark II. The Mark II will develop, the design development and the prototype will fly around 2026. But by the time you get into series production and you start coming in big numbers, it will be past 2030. So when I pointed out the importance of centenary year in 2032, the Indian Air Force, as the chief pointed out in the press conference 2 days ago, is not going to be at 42 squadron strength. It will be at best, a 35 squadron by 2035. And therefore, this is, this is where I go back to the previous slide where I linked to defense economy and industry issues. This is where the articulation of a national security strategy in very clear terms becomes extremely important for individual military services to develop their force structures correctly. Air defense is linked to the fighter force and the missile force structures. Once again, air defense is the primary, role of the Indian Air Force. But at the same time, it is not only defensive, and air defense is also achieved by an offensive projection of power. And therefore, you need the wherewithal for those, capabilities, which in terms of missiles, it will be long-range missiles, which in terms of aircraft, you need not only numbers, but you need aircraft with, greater strength. And therefore, the Mark II, Tejas Mark II becomes important, the AMCA becomes important, and the accelerated development of these programs is extremely important. We may have to think about a strategic bomber as well, given the responsibilities that come with India becoming a rising power and an important, great power in the international system. With that responsibility, you will need to exercise an international security responsibility for which you may need a strategic bomber requirement. Today's technology allows, better exploitation of your resources, and that is thanks to the computerization, digital networking, and what we call as, the war is changing to what's known as the network-centric warfare, is a process in which you're moving away from, individual platform-centric strength to an interconnected, information dominant and real-time information flow systems that dominate your application of or use of your weapon systems. So that also changes the concept of one of the most important principles of war, which is mass and concentration of force. That gets turned on its head because with networking, with lesser numbers, I can actually cover larger geographical areas and still be able to apply force the way. Okay. What is the next one? Below technology, that slide is getting covered. Okay, then the R&D and the industry is something that I've already explained. Research and development that needs to actually address not only the military's requirement, but the Air Force requirement. As I said, technology at the highest levels operate in the aviation domain. And therefore, unless we actually focus investments and research and development in those areas, your national security, IAF's role in the national security will always be facing significant challenges as we are doing today. Next slide, please. So what will be the IAF of the future, or what should we be looking at the Air Force of the future? When I say future, starting off from now over the next 20 years or next 15 years. We are still operating MiG-21s, which are, with upgrades, I can probably call them as the third generation aircraft. We have Jaguars, which are nearly 40 years old, but with significant upgrades, we brought them to close to fourth generation, but I would still say it's a little less than fourth generation aircraft. We have upgraded the Mirage 2000s, which have now come to, I would say, fourth generation class, maybe even 4.5 generation. And what we really have is the real state-of-the-art aircraft is the Rafale, 2 squadrons that we will complete by end of the year. They are 4.5 generation aircraft. And the 5th generation fighter, the AMCA, will become a 5th generation fighter. The Su-30, which is the backbone of the Indian Air Force as of today, is still falls between 4 and 4.5. It is 4th generation technically, but unless the upgrade is done, it will remain at 4, and if the upgrade is done, it will move up to the 4.5 generation. The 5th generation fighter aircraft is an aircraft that is extensively, capable of networking with other sensors, and the digitization is at the highest level. The IAF is already capable of some of the important characteristics, which is an ability to penetrate to targets with significant capabilities in electronic warfare and information dominance. Its precision weapons capability is now increasing, constantly improving, and we are largely a precision weapons operating Indian Air Force. The command control network, the IAF has done quite well, which is in terms of networking. One of the first things that we required, and I was personally involved in this entire process, is that the entire air defense radar system needed to be networked. So if I'm sitting in one corner of the country, I should still be able to see what's happening in the Indian skies anywhere in over India. And this is the theoretical and the technical aspect of networking. So the IACCS, as what is called as Indian Air Command and Control System, is not only a networked air defense sensors, but it is also a command and control system. And what does that provide for the leaders who are there at the decision-making chain? It allows them to get a real-time composite operational picture, which enables them to take the decisions as quickly as possible. And it's transmitted in real time to the corners where force needs to be applied or responses need to be done. And therefore, the IACCS, which is moved into the second phase, is more or less operational, is a very good ground grid that's been well established. Now that needs to be supported by the relevant weapons, missiles, the aircraft, and of course the force multipliers like the AVACS and air-to-air refuelers and other elements that come with respect to applying themselves in information warfare and cyber warfare, etc. So information issue it's a constant development process. But I would say, let me put it on record that I think we are reasonably doing well in this area. We need numbers of aircraft to come in. We need to increase the numbers of force multipliers. And of course, the weapons is a continuous development process. Missiles have to come. Air defense missiles, we are a little short. The S-400 will come soon, but I think we need to, get more varieties to come into the entire process. Reach is again, I will explain this when I come to explaining the national security strategy. Reach is one. There are two elements to the reach part. One, wherever you find in your threat environment, you should be able to reach to any corner to apply force and defend yourself. That, I think we have no doubt that we can do that, right? But there is a second element of reach, which is, as a country, I want to also defend the areas of interest, which can be well beyond our borders. And therefore, in those areas, what most prime ministers have articulated invariably in terms of India's natural areas of interest is from Gulf of Aden to Malacca Straits. If that is your strategic area of interest, your ability to reach in any corner of that area of interest is vital. And that needs long-range aircraft. That needs space coverage, space surveillance. That needs a very significant continuous 24/7 C4ISR. That needs your fighters to be able to reach if there is a threat to neutralize that. That's where the bomber comes into the picture as well. And then, of course, the ability to network and work harmoniously with the Navy and the Army to be able to bring in a coordinated, integrated application of force or project power is extremely important. So reach needs to be understood. It manifests itself in many dimensions, and that needs to be understood well. And when you understand that part, then you'll see how the IAF is developing or how the other two militaries are also developing. Expeditionary is extremely important. We have a good expeditionary capability reasonably well. We can probably expand this as well. The future wars are going to change. They're already changing. Okay, so what are the new wars going to be likely? Like Plato said, only the dead have seen the end of war. So given our environment is unique, ours is a nuclear environment. Pakistan, our adversary on the west, is a nuclear weapon state. In today's environment, it's quite correct to call China as an adversary with what's happening in Ladakh. And therefore, That's the nuclear weapon state, and it's already a great power. So we live in an environment which is a nuclear environment. Deterrence comes into play in a big way, and therefore to be able to get into a conventional big war will be disastrous for everyone. And therefore national leaderships will look at that as an extremely and absolutely the last choice. Nevertheless, you still have to be prepared to deter so that should a miscalculation lead to such an event, you are able to tackle that. And therefore, major military, we will remain a major military, China will remain a major world-class military, Pakistan is a sizable military as well. So it will continue to be there. But at the same time, when you have dissatisfied powers like Pakistan, when you have an ambitious power like China creating problems in Iraq, these problems manifest itself as undeclared wars, and they happen in a domain between low intensity conflict and subconventional warfare. How do you tackle this? When you bring in new technologies, particularly when China is now talking about intelligentized warfare theories, then you are bringing in high-tech processes into this, into this conflict situation, which is application of drones and robotics, artificial intelligence, and of course the constant coverage in terms of providing real-time information through a very robust C4ISR mechanisms. So new wars, or the wars of the future, can actually happen in very small, specified, limited areas, and can actually bring in swarming technology that can use micro and mini UAVs in huge numbers to be able to pick out targets individually and target and neutralize those targets with very highly advanced plastic explosives. And they are autonomous. They don't need data link to get control from the ground control center. Once you launch and they are programmed, they will reach their targets. This will become a challenge for everyone in the world, and particularly for India. And how do you deal with this? And this is the challenge that each of the services, particularly the Air Force, will have to actually start looking at. The next slide, please. So when I spoke about net-centric warfare, this is the most of you would understand. There is a shooter grid, there is an information grid, and there is a sensor grid. And sensors, pick up or monitor, what's happening in the area of coverage, translate that into the kind of information flow, and therefore there is a networking that takes place. The information flow also gets the information from the weapon systems and their readiness and their placements and their locations, etc. And ultimately that becomes a command and control grid that actually takes inputs to the sensor grid, decides the availability of weapon systems, and then provides the application of force through the shooter grid. And because of this networking capability, as I said, with fewer numbers, and particularly in the Air Force domain, with fewer numbers, you can cover much larger area because you're able to swing forces and apply force, in the area of interest, because of the real-time coverage, the ability to react and take decisions quickly. If you've heard of a term called OODA loop, which is observe, decide, act, and observe, orient, decide, and act is a continuous cycling that takes place, and the digital world makes that possible. So all the time you're ahead of the adversary in that cycling, and with your electronic warfare, cyber warfare, and other mechanisms, you're also parallelly slowing down the cycling of the adversary. And when that happens, this is the kind of a war that you're going to be looking at in the future. Next slide. Yeah. So moving from the net-centric warfare is the technologies today now make it possible. The crux of modern technology in the net-centric warfare capabilities is ultimately your communication systems. We are all, today you can't live without a mobile, right? The same mobile technologies use the same communication system, what's known as the software-defined radio. We are moving away from software-defined radio to cognitive radio. And those tend to actually create information on a real-time basis to various operators and decision makers. So ultimately, what is NCW? It uses the physical domain, it uses the information domain and the social domain, which are collaborative decisions, brings them all into the center region that you actually see, which is the NCW, which combines, three elements: a shared awareness from the fusion of these three areas that I've mentioned earlier, brings in compressed operations, which creates the fast tempo of operations and quick application of force, and of course the precision force is which generates the speed and access as quickly as possible. So future wars, will transform themselves. You may not actually be, while big weapon platforms are there to deter, your real usage of weapon platforms and weapons may actually be far smaller. Like I said, the micro and mini UAVs, and these will come into play using artificial intelligence integrated into various processes like the swarming algorithms, etc. And as this develops, you will find the questions will automatically come. Like a massive aircraft carrier that costs billions and billions of dollars. Do I need that when these kind of capabilities come through much smaller platforms, which can actually even neutralize the aircraft carrier because of the swarming technology and the drones that can come into play? So there is a lot of change that's likely to happen in the future war domain. Technology is the crux, and air power is the crux. And this is what China is actually working on. This is what the US is working on. This is an area that Indian Air Force and Indian military and the Indian government needs to look at as well. Can you move on to the next slide? Yeah. So national power and military instrument, when we look at from a national security perspective, I raised few questions. Last year onwards, or even today, we've had some more intrusions from the Chinese side. The situation in Ladakh, we've been handling it in a certain way, which people, scholars call it as a continental approach, a defensive approach. The question is, India's approach in the past has been defensive. Is it true? Second, we've been reluctant to use air power in peacetime to enforce our, positions and our standards. So, for example, both on the LAC and the LOC. Why? Is the use of air power escalatory? And that has been the general condition, which I told you that barrier was broken in Kargil. And I think Balakot is a significant development, but we need to actually now go beyond that, because you can't have it in one-off application. I think use of air power in your national security strategy must become the most prominent element as a continuous process, which will change our approach to dealing with the adversaries from a defensive status quo approach to more aggressive, more pushing our stand more effectively and deter the adversaries more effectively. Next slide, please. Okay, so ultimately, let me come to the main adversary. The elephant in the room is China, and therefore, what is it that we need to actually do in the case of China? The first line that I've indicated there indicates a country's national power. NP stands for national power, and these are measurable entities on the left, which is critical mass, economic power, and military power. Critical mass combines geography, territory, your natural resources, and population. And population is about the productivity of the population, and therefore education, a whole lot of other factors come into it. Economic power is self-explanatory, military power is self-explanatory. These are additive, measurable quantities. To measure a country's power, this element is easily measurable. But the second one is a multiplication factor. AE is a coefficient of aerospace power. This is something I've developed myself. And therefore, unless your technologies are in control, your coefficient of aerospace power will never reach 1. So we put 1 to the US, which is the technology leader, and we bring in a comparative element, and you'll find when you do that analysis, that will give you an element of understanding as to where we stand. And the other multiplication factor is an additive factor of 2 elements, is the strategy, national security strategy. Plus, W is the will to follow through that strategy. which means you have to study your past wars, your past situations and crisis situations, analyze how have we handled it, and is there a national political leadership exhibits the will to follow through a strategy that's been articulated. Frankly speaking, this last part of this element, both strategy and the will to follow through the strategy, is a problem in India. One, we haven't articulated our national security strategy. We are shy of articulating our national security strategy. Why is that? Is a question that every researcher must ask. Okay, unless you articulate a national security strategy, unless we bring out a white paper which clearly defines what is our security parameters, what are our security red lines, when you define that, it will have an impact on many factors. One, it will have an impact on the kind of force structures that you need to develop, because it defines what needs to be defended, what needs to be achieved. For example, India is the only great power that still has parts of its territories under occupation by adversaries. So national security strategy will clearly define whether you have an intention of recovering it at the earliest or maintain a status quo position on existing lines. Practically, that's what we're following. But if you define it clearly, then the national leadership will be forced to actually address many other aspects of force structure, technology development, and a whole lot of other factors. And when that gets addressed, then the will to follow through that strategy automatically will materialize as a pressure point on the national political leadership. And this is necessary to tame the dragon. If you now do a comparative analysis with Chinese, that is the difference probably you'll find. So to formulate an effective strategy and will to follow through that strategy is an issue that we need to learn from the adversary as well and from our own history. From 50 to 62, 67, 75, 87, 2013, 2017, now in 2020. And China has had territorial disputes with every one of its neighbors, 23 territorial disputes. But in each of that case, it has clearly defined what it wants to achieve and continues to persist and achieve most of those processes. Notwithstanding all that, given our terrain advantages, given our geography, our ability to, with a 42 strong air force and with the 1.14 million strong army and a navy that we have, in areas of contest where we can have a conflict or a problem with China, invariably we can actually create a local superiority or a favorable local military balance with respect to the Chinese. This is something we need to look at in evolving our national security strategy. Okay, next one. This is the map I've just indicated. So those of you who want to ask questions later, we can discuss. This is the kind of advantage that we have. Look at our airfields all along our border. We have the advantage of operating from lower altitudes. The Tibetan altitude on average is a height of 4 to 4.5 kilometers, and much of the Air Force, even with most of the Air Force is becoming J-10 and J-11 and J-16, which are 4.5 generation aircraft. Even then, they still have serious problems with respect to operating from high altitude airfields. And then the distances are more as well. So in terms of air power equation, we still have a stronger, a better position, and we only need to strengthen it with marginal issues that need to be addressed, as I pointed out. Okay, next one, please. So how should air power be used in India's national security strategy or military strategy? The bottom line is deterrence, coercion, and compellence. The force structure needs to be addressed with keeping that in mind. And we have reasonable airlift capability. We need to expand that a little bit. Address areas of ISR and space. Space will come in a big way. Our NAVIC space constellation is a good development. We may need to expand that as well. And then, of course, weapons, both in terms of missiles. We need to create a rocket force, as CDS has mentioned. This is something we recommended in 2011. And I'm glad that this thought process is now taking effect. We probably take a page out of the Chinese PLA rocket forces strategy and probably replicate that to deter the Chinese and give them the kind of taste of their own medicine in this process. Okay, next one. Next slide, please. So there is a lot of discussions on theater commands. This is, I think, for want of time, I think I will keep that to the discussion points when they want to. Anybody who has questions on this. But let me just sum it up here that the issue of theater commands needs conceptual clarity. First, you need to articulate national security strategy officially in the form of a white paper to the rest of the world. And theater commands, it is not about just integrated operations. Integrated operations we've been doing, but theater command has much more to it. And one of the most important elements is that India and power projection needs clarity on that kind of a policy. And then automatically the force structures and theater commands will fall into place. This is something we can discuss in detail later. Next slide, please. So the Air Force, I would, this is one of my approach to addressing a 20-year national strategy for the Indian Air Force, which will, address the national security requirements. One is obviously we need to build back to 42 combat squadrons, which will largely be Mark IIs and AMCAs and the Su-30s and derivatives of that. But, many years ago, we had something called Auxiliary Air Force. Army has a territorial army element. The Navy now has got the Coast Guard. But the Auxiliary Air Force was wound up. For want of finances, it was merged into the Indian Air Force. The Auxiliary Air Force is something like the Air National Guard of the US. To address both the Indian industry, indigenous aircraft development, as well as to address many other aspects of internal security and certain aspects of external security, Air National Guard mechanism can actually be brought back. The Auxiliary Air Force can actually be created as an Air National Guard across the country. And this also becomes a sort of a feeder system for the main Air Force in terms of both trained pilots as well as a reserve force structure of aircraft. For this, you can actually use the Tejas Mark 1A, which means the industry will then be able to produce more number of aircraft. It will refine itself better and better, and therefore it will bring out derivative products in a better way. So there are lots of benefits that can come out of this. This is something that needs to be looked at. Industry needs to combine public and private in defense. We need to recognize the fact that defense industry is a critical element of national economy, both in terms of job provision, technology development, education, and of course, business. Without exports, military exports, your defense industry will not grow. And therefore, this is an important element. Ultimately, of course, the crux of future wars will be your ability to fine-tune UAVs and UCAV technologies and swarming technologies, and of course, the long-range bomber in terms of projection of power. Next slide, please. So some of these issues are to highlight the aircraft that we are looking at. AMCA is the Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft, still in the design stage. The prototype is likely to come out around 2026 as claimed by HAL and the ADA. But it would take another 10 years before the development testing gets over, and then it can go into a series production. There are critical technology areas where we will still depend on external support and imported products as well. And that needs to be understood. And therefore, our research strategies and the Air Force needs to be fully involved in this. It is involved in any case, but it needs to actually address some of these critical areas. Next slide. So what are the threats that we face on the other side in terms of air power technology? The Chinese Air Force, the PLA Air Force has transformed itself significantly. Much of its aircraft already 4.5 generation and 5th generation. The top aircraft that you see is J-20, is a 5th generation aircraft. And 5th generation aircraft, how did they crack? In the 1989-1990 time frame, there was not much of a difference between Indian defense industry and the Chinese defense industry. They were ahead on missiles, they were ahead on space, they were ahead on rocket forces. But in terms of aircraft design and development, there was not much of a difference. But they leapfrogged within the next 25 years. And today they are more or less catching up with the Americans. That's a 5th generation fighter aircraft. They are still way behind on the engines side, but they're far ahead on the engines as compared to us. So we need to study this. We need to understand how has this happened. And the aircraft below looks very much like the American B-2, is the X-20, which is the 5th generation stealth bomber, which will come out into, it's already flying, it's finished its development, and they've announced it will enter the service in 2025. From interior China, the aircraft can take off, do a round trip to Australia, bomb its targets in Australia, and come back to the mainland. That's the kind of a range it will have. Then, more importantly, it is a stealth bomber as well. So the electronics and the other factors and the materials, you know, it gives you an indication as to the kind of technological capabilities that they come to. So this is a threat. You know, it is not just the fighting on the ground or in the air is a threat. It is the capabilities that are now mushrooming and coming out into the open. And then their alliance with Pakistan, these need to be seen as a big threat, and we need to address that. Yeah, next one. So in conclusion, the summing up that I would say is, nature of war is changing. It's more about command and control, and you know, technologies like artificial intelligence, drones, and robotics that's taking charge and coming into the fore. Unmanned platforms will hold sway by the time we, you know, touch 2047, our 100th, you know, Independence Day. But you know, technology developments are galloping in this region, and the Chinese are closing gap with the Americans, and that is a threat issue for us. What should India do is to lead in national military strategy and diplomacy by factoring these threats and understanding them well and crafting a national security strategy more effectively to combine not only our political objectives and political strategies and announce it to the world, but more importantly, address the technology development by institutions like, you know, the Manipal University and other universities needs to be plugged into the R&D institutions, you know, as a continuous process. That's the difference between the American system and our system as well. So this is an important area. India's ability to project power is vital. Capability should be rooted in Indian industry, and both these factors are extremely important. I hope this is achieved over the next 20 years, and hopefully with all the efforts and announcements that are coming under, the Indian Air Force will be able to play a vital role in this process. Thank you very much, and I think I'll take on the questions anyway.
Thank you, sir. I think that was an extremely erudite lecture, and now we'll open up for the question answer session. Those of you are asking questions, please do introduce yourself, and then the questions need to be pointed towards today's lecture, and if there are any other things that we can take it later. Now I'll open up the forum. Mr. Kiran, let's start with you.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Kiran. I'm a second year student at the department here in Geopolitics and International Relations. Thanks for that detailed lecture, sir. My question is regarding the theaterization that you mentioned. So there have been controversies over how IAF is being marginalized in the proposed theaterization. So do you think this will affect the national security? Also, like, are these controversies a sign of hollowness in the jointness of our armed forces? Thank you, sir.
Now,
sir, you want to go one by one, or you would want to collect a set of questions, sir?
We can, okay, we can collect one more question.
Okay. Shivraj. Shivraj Rajkumar, please go ahead.
Yes, hello, sir. Thank you for that amazing presentation. And obviously, it is a matter of pride for us to know that, you know, our defense is so well equipped and advanced. And of course, being a part of, you know, being a third generation, having two people in being Air Force veterans, it is a matter of pride for, you know, getting a chance to speak with you. Sir, I would like to say, you know, obviously, a lot of the times where the conflicts that arise are not central to one country. It's usually like, as we noticed with the border skirmish that happened with China. So I would like to ask you, is it better for us to go tit for tat in terms of our defense, or is it better to be the bigger man. Obviously, we do not, want to escalate any matters, and we want the cooler heads to prevail. So is it better to be the bigger man in situations like these? And yeah, of course, thank you for your service to our country, sir. So yeah.
Okay. Shall I take on, Kishore?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay, Kiran, with respect to your theatre command issues, is with the theatre command, the necessity of a theatre command, there is no ambiguity on that. From the perspectives of optimization, every war today is firstly, let me clarify one thing, because a lot of statements tend to actually create the impression that each service will fight its war. No, a nation fights a war. The Army, Navy, and Air Force are instruments available to the national political leadership to be used in the war fighting. And war today is an integrated affair. It's not now. That started off with the Blitzkrieg that the Germans launched. Well, from then on, people have realized that the war is an integrated, affair. In a war that creates coordination between the two or more services. Well, what is the essence of that process? The essence of that process is that an operational planning has to be joined, for which you need structures for constantly creating that operational process. In the German system, the German general headquarters did that work, right? And but unfortunately, we didn't follow that kind of a process. We created independent headquarters. Each of the service creates its own planning, and then brings in subsequently the coordination part, and therefore that creates a problem. Second is from a country's perspective, military is an expensive business. Military equipment are very, very expensive. And therefore, every country and every finance minister will look at how do I optimize, get maximum bang for the buck, and still reduce my expenditures. Is to integrate, correct? Integration is not getting everybody into one color uniform. No, because each one has its characteristics, traditions, everything. But to be able to operate in an integrated fashion, so that if I have a strength that is specific to the air power, it need not be duplicated in some other form to the Army or the Navy. And I bring in and I apply that strength effectively in support of their their operations on the ground or on the surface, right? So that's the way it needs to be done. So that coordination is already happening in the acquisition process. The ideas were set up in 2003. It's evolved, and since I've spent a lot of time through that. And these are the reasons why integrated perspective plans processes have evolved. And therefore, you try and make sure that your procurements and acquisitions happen taking into consideration whether somebody would duplicate the same thing elsewhere, and you avoid that, and you bring in the the expenses low. But from an operational perspective, what you need is a proper understanding of the theatre command. A theatre command then will bring in a commander of a theatre who understands the integrated approach to warfare, but he will have the components of all three elements or two elements minimum, right? And they will be commanders. They will be the CNCs who will, because an air power application, and I as an air power expert will know better than the overall commander who understands what needs to be done from a larger perspective. So I bring in the expert view and expert application process there, and then that is how it needs to be integrated. So the theatre command process is not one service leading the other at all times. It is actually an integration of strengths of the two or three services, and the leaders have to understand that process, giving adequate independence. So if we have limited resources, and if we create theatre command and say the Air Force resources will be now divided between various theatres, then you are actually not understanding the application of air power. Because air power inherently is multitasking, right? I can use the same aircraft for air defense, I can use the same aircraft for strike, I can use the same aircraft for electronic warfare and many other roles. And therefore, this is the problem. So the same issues have been, a problem in the US as well when they created unified commands. The concept of unified command is to create a single commander who takes charge of the overall objectives to be achieved in a theater war, but give adequate independence to the independent forces. So they grapple with this, turf wars for 25 years till Goldwater-Nicholas committee came in and sorted out much of that problem. So if you look at the 91 Gulf War, if you see how the first 40 days of 45 days, air power was the only one that was playing the role. It was shaping the battlefield. It was creating conditions for the military, the army, finally to swing and finish the work in the next 72 hours, 100 hours. The Norman Schwarzkopf precisely spent 4 days. That's about all. But for 45, 50 days, the air power created that situation, right? And this is the kind of coordination that needs to be understood. Second is, of course, today's technology allows you to create situational awareness. Earlier, situational awareness was in terms of communication. By the time that communication reaches me, it would be 48 hours old or 24 hours old. Things would have changed. Today, I can see it exactly at the same time that something is happening on the ground, thanks to space technologies, thanks to communication technologies. I can see the picture. But the tendency for senior leaders to now intervene and start interfering with lower tactical leaders should be prevented. Therefore, this is called as centralized command, but decentralized execution. Therefore, you give that kind of a freedom. These are all factors that need to be understood. More importantly, besides that, comes the larger issue, which is about command and control. What do you do with theater commanders in terms of protocols and ranks and other structures? What is the command structure that you will follow? So will a theater commander be a 4-star or a 3-star? I believe it needs to be a 4-star. If there is a 4-star, what happens to the existing chiefs? What happens to their control? It's not easy to now. You've had the chiefs and individual services taking care of the complete operational control. Will that change? You can't change overnight. There has to be a time frame and a slow process in which you will change that process. But more importantly, power projection is extremely important, and therefore the national security strategy articulation is important. When these factors are considered, then you'll find that the theater command system will take shape in a better way. Right? Okay.
Yeah.
The second question was, can you just remind me, what was the second question again? Shivraj?
Yes, my second question was, I mean, as somebody who has 2 veterans in their homes, I mean, my grandfather being in service for 19 years and my dad being in service for 29 years, who was active during Kargil and not obviously directly active, but as he was in Bangalore. But my question was, usually in situations like what happened last year in the India-China border skirmish, it wasn't a centrally
I've understood
unanimous decision. It was just an incident
how do
that
we
happened.
Deal with it? Yeah. So how do we deal with it is your question, correct? How do you diffuse it? How do we take an aggressive stand, or do we take a different position? Now, I mentioned that statement that India is the only country that has significant amount of its territories under occupation by some other your adversaries. So the first question is, if you all remember in the 1990s, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao made a statement in Lok Sabha that there is while we can talk peace with Pakistan, the only unfinished job that is required to be done is to recover the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So he makes a very clear statement, which is official in the Lok Sabha. It gets transmitted to the rest of the world, right? And therefore that should define what your military objectives are, military strategies are. That should define what your behavior in case of any conflict situation, how you're going to act, etc. All that will get defined in that process. But it remained a statement in the Lok Sabha. It doesn't get reflected anywhere else in terms of an official white paper or official document. Right. So, and therefore it leaves an ambiguity because leaders change, parties change, and they could bring in a different, aspect of it. Invariably, with China, we've also said we will dialogue, we'll continue to dialogue, we'll diffuse the situation. So while we've been maintaining a soft position and we've been careful not to escalate things, Chinese have taken advantage of penetrating whenever they can and then occupy small slices of territory over periods of time. And I think you need to call that bluff. This is where I say, while we don't want to escalate, you can call that bluff by saying, let's sit down and clearly define where LAC. His understanding of LAC runs somewhere, my understanding of LAC runs somewhere else. Let's come to a common point. Let's define the LAC. If you don't want to define the LAC, then I will enforce LAC on my terms. That enforcement is an aggressive posture that we need to take, because you can enforce that not through only ground forces, but more by air power application. And this is what I mean by taking a strong stand. But that doesn't mean it escalates uncontrollably. It will not, because you're dealing with force application in your own claimed territory, not crossing the border across into another's territory. These are important factors. So I think there is a requirement to relook at our military strategies in the way we are dealing with China. And I think the fear of escalation is overburdening our approach to dealing with the problem effectively on the ground.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. There is another question from Kiran.
Yes.
The classroom is, they want to ask a question, sir. So
yeah,
I'm
please go.
requesting Kiran raising the hand. So please go ahead with that. Kiran?
Yeah, sir, I'm asking. Yeah. Hi, sir, this is Srinivas, a second-year master student from Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. Thank you, yes, sir, for the great lecture. My question was regarding the Kaveri engine. That what are the specific technological bottlenecks that GTRE has encountered in development of this Kaveri engine? And my second question was, how do you see technology evolving beyond 5th generation? Like, what would be a specific technology in a 5.5 generation era? These are my two questions, sir.
5.5 generation. You're talking about aircraft? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, in terms of Kaveri engine, let me put it this way. Aero engine technology is a complex affair. It has metallurgy, it has a design, it has thermodynamics optimization, and there are many, factors that come into design. A whole lot of things come into it. It's a very, very complex and it is the most difficult technological process to master. So if a country is overcome all the challenges and been able to produce a successful aero engine and continue to operate it as per its designed objectives very well, then that country has crossed the barrier. The Chinese aero engines are flying, but still it's suboptimal. They've been working at it for 40 years. They've just pumped in for one research something like $2.5 billion into addressing the shortfalls. We have not invested very much at all. We hope to make a Kaveri engine with an initial investment of less than 500 crores. And so when we start from scratch, then it is easy to actually say by theory and by textbooks that I need to optimize the thermodynamic cycle and I will actually crack the secret. Practically, that doesn't work out that. Why? Because many of these countries have also gone through a lot of failures. They've done lots of research and they have a huge database on which they keep refining, relating to the database, and then they finally develop. Once you crack the first time, thereafter it's derivative process. So the Americans, British, French, Russians, and now the Chinese have complete control on aero engine technology. Nobody will share it with anybody. This is an area that nobody is going to share that technology with anyone. And therefore, you have to do it yourself. The other option is to create a strategic partnership and alliance with a country on a long-term basis. And then he gives you an access to look into the database, and that you learn that process and then you develop it. Much of our process has been, we have a problem, we give it to the Russians, they will address it, they'll give you. They all take you around the bend because they don't want you to accelerate your development process and they slow you down. So this has been the story of Kaveri. It still has not gone into a stage where it can be successfully flown. But I suppose you don't have a choice but continue to invest and do research on that. The mistakes where I would point out, which I pointed out in my report as well, is that we jumped straight into developing a fourth generation aero engine. Kaveri engine was technology in theory terms was equivalent to the Aerojet. We have not made an engine before. There's not a single aero engine that flies, other than, of course, successfully we made an engine for a drone. But you need to actually develop from smaller steps and build your database to be able to crack the bigger one. This is the mistake that we made. We make that mistake on many other technology projects as well. So engine is going to be a tough challenge for us. Unless we join up hands with one of the engine majors from the US or French, who will take their pound of flesh, they will make you, work for many decades. Only then they'll allow you to crack that process. It's a leveraging strategy that one has to follow, and it's a big challenge. There is no easy way out in that process. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Shivraj. Shivraj, you want to ask a question?
Yes, sir. Actually, I would like to ask this question on behalf of Nandini. She would like to ask you what opportunities are there for communication students in the defense field? What opportunities are there?
Communication is a very big area. I mean, the world is open to you completely. Like I told you about the software-defined radio. So today, firstly, the communication has changed from classical communication technologies to a completely digital communication. You only have the base layer, and the rest of it is all algorithms and software-related ones. You're moving into cognitive radio processes. But the crux of all that is, the world is information hungry, and the military is equally information hungry. And therefore, you want to have data flow all the time, right? One is a voice communication. The other one is the larger issue is data communication. So in a net-centric warfare, let me talk about the software-defined radio, which becomes the heart of that entire process in an aircraft. The radio will have to now link itself to multiple sensors. And there is a sampling rate which will, in an aircraft, in the aviation scene, the sampling rates are very high, unlike on the maritime domain or on the ground. But the idea is to collect all that information, whether it's my GPS coordinates, whether it's my radar information, whether it's my weapons information, and give me a situational picture, which creates my understanding, creates my situational awareness on a real-time basis. If I translate that into a tactical radio to the army, and then, a platoon that's operating in a particular battlefield in a certain area. And until now, in olden times, he will have his, radio. He will talk to the, battalion headquarters or his company headquarters, and then battalion headquarters. This process is a very slow process. He won't know what's happening in his adjacent area where another platoon is deployed. Whereas with a tactical radio, which is now interconnected with space-based systems, etc., you are now getting a situational picture. Not only you know what's happening around you and your colleagues nearby you who are deployed elsewhere, but even on the area of operations of adjacent platoons and adjacent companies. And that creates a different understanding and awareness, of the operational situation. So communication is the crux of all that process. Communication is a field that's opening up. It's already opened up. We are dependent on imported communication because you got to develop your own waveforms, you got to develop your own technologies, you got to develop your own chips. There's a lot of scope there. I advised one of the companies who mastered a chip, but that's the only company in the country that's probably which has the capability for international indigenous capability on software-defined radio, and therefore I think we need to actually look at communication field as the most important field in our process.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
So one hand coming from the classroom. Is there anyone, Kiran?
Hello, sir. I'm Aishwarya. I would like to ask a question on behalf of Gayatri, one of my classmates. So her question is that she wants to know about the Operation Safed Sagar and how it has changed the role of Air Force in the Indian war strategy.
No, I didn't get that. Can you repeat? Your voice was not clear.
Okay, the question is like how the Operation Safed Sagar and how it changed the role of Indian Air Force in the Indian war strategy.
Can someone repeat? Kishore, can you repeat? I'm not able to make out.
Kiran, please repeat
Hello?
it. I think it is not audible. That's why.
Not very audible in the.
Yes, I'll repeat the question for you once again. It's like
Yes.
the person wants to know about Operation Safed Sagar and how it changed the role of Indian Air Force in Indian war strategy.
Oh, okay, fine. Okay, Operation Safed Sagar. That's Kargil. Okay, the Air Force calls it Operation Safed Sagar. The Army calls it a different name. But Kargil War was a watershed moment. So, like I said, after 71, the Indian Air Force has not been used, in any conflict situation. Although we've had frequent, cross-border terrorism and frequent, intrusions by Pakistan and even from the Chinese side. But the Kargil War was a significant intrusion into the hills. And again, as usual, the tendency was to use only the army to throw the, intruders out. It would have been a Herculean task because they really took us by surprise. There was an intelligence failure as well. So the use of air power was sort of initially, if you start using the air power, then it would escalate. It would become a full-fledged war rather than a limited operation. And this is where I think a lot of discussion took place. They said, no, it's time we applied air power. That is the only way effectively we can throw the intruders out. One. Second, in order to, have escalation control, the Prime Minister, Vajpayee at that time, now put certain restrictions. He said, use air power only in our territory. That means they've come into intruded into our territory, occupied the heights in Kargil, and so apply air power in that region. We will not cross the LOC into the Gilgit-Baltistan area, into the POK area, nor will we cross anywhere else unless they, escalate. We will not cross the international border as well. This was, given the international support that we managed to get, and given the international environment, it was probably a sensible, guideline, directive, political directive that the Prime Minister gave. But in hindsight, I think probably we could have, taken better risk and then probably thrown the Pakistanis out and vacated the POK also. Anyway, that is debatable. But I think this is the watershed moment for use of air power. Since then, I think the political leadership must have better confidence in using air power as the first choice of application of force in a conflict situation or in a crisis situation. So Operation Safed Sagar is one of the important developments, is this part. Second one is, of course, application of aircraft itself. The technologies and the weapons and the application. So if you notice, for the first month, we were using the MiG-23s and MiG-21s, and not very effective. The Jaguars were also being used. Then, of course, since I personally was involved in the modification of the electronic laser-guided bombs on the Mirages were used and they produced results because of the precision weapons. So again, Kargil War demonstrated the effectiveness of precision weapons even in a mountainous terrain, which was out of proportion to the number of weapons that you used. So these are the most important developments. Apart from, of course, the international, external affairs interacting and creating an international opinion in favor of India. Yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
Anybody else has any questions?
Somebody was asking in between when I was just saying. So
I think it was just somebody put on the mic, sir. Sorry for the disturbance.
Oh, no problem.
Are there no other questions? Okay, now I would request Mr. Shishuraj. He is an Air Force enthusiast. He is also intern at Center for Air Power Studies with Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur. Shishuraj, over to you.
Thank you, sir. This was one of most comprehensive lecture that I have ever heard on role of air power in general and in particular about IAF's role that it had played right from nation building that you have talked about since 1932 itself. So, sir, I would be presenting the formal vote of thanks this evening. So, I would first like to thank the esteemed speaker of today, Air Marshal Dr. Matheswaran, AVSM VM. I had like some of the major takeaways from his lecture was right from how IAF helped India in 47, 48, 61, 62 and 79 and particularly in 99. It covered both kinetic and non-kinetic usage of air power, and how he also highlighted that Balakot strike was one of the paradigm shift as far as the use of air power is concerned. Then I will talk about highlight his specific contributions that he has made in quantifying the national power. And there, the most interesting thing that I have heard was the coefficient of aerospace power that he has highlighted, and how he considers America as one in the sense of technological capacity and technological capacity and mastery, and how India, if it wants to play a role of great power, it should strive to achieve that efficiency. At the same time, his quantification of critical mass and consideration of economy, military, as well as the importance that he laid that how India should also come up with a defense white paper, where India should clearly state that what are its goals, what are its strategic interests, and what force structure it strive to build in future, so that adversaries are also aware of our capabilities and our line of thinking. And one of the most important thing was how he highlighted that how India lacked political will in use of air power. Although we had capabilities, comparable capabilities, we didn't use it, we didn't cross that line, that moral boundary that we have put upon ourselves. Then one of the major takeaways that how you have highlighted the network-centric warfare, or how warfare would evolve in future. Like what would be the scenario when drones would come in, swarms would come in, and autonomous systems and AI would come in. Finally, one of again a major takeaway is like 20 years national strategy for IAF. That is again his own contribution that I personally love. So how he highlighted that the AMCA would come in 2026, and then it would again take 20 years to like come into operational part of IAF. At the same time, he also highlighted that how India needs 42 combat squadron, and one of the major analysis is till 2032 we will have a depleting strength, because the more aircraft in terms of sorry sir the more aircraft that we will get, Tejas Mark 1 and 2, we have to replace the existing systems, 3rd and 4th generation aircraft. So this was also one of the major takeaway, that how the numerical strength would be more or less same. And last thing that was the most striking part is like how the IAF needs a strategic bomber, which I have been hearing from many experts, but his emphasis on the comparative Chinese development, and how India should, being a great power and to exercise power across its domain of interest, India also should look up to that technology. Okay, sir, and now I'd like to thank Dr. Padma Rani, Director MIC, for introducing the speaker and setting the tone of lecture. I would also like to thank Dr. Nanda Kishore and Dr. Ravi for moderating the lecture. And I'm also extremely grateful to Vice Chancellor Dr. MD Venkatesh for giving the presidential address and gracing the occasion. Last but not the least, I would like to thank audience and other participants who made this lecture engaging. Thank you again. Thank you all.
Thank you, Shishuraj.